Hello, my name is Olurotimi. I like to talk about history, world history, and I talk about American presidents as well. Talking about American presidents, I came across a headline, didn't get into the details, but President Trump's defamation suit against the Wall Street Journal for publishing his birthday letter to Epstein was dismissed. It was thrown out. It was dismissed. So, which brings me to my discussion today. I'm going to be talking about defamation, right? Defamation per se, and false accusations of a mental illness. So, of course, and this is in the wake of calls by the American public that Vice President J.D. Vance and the cabinet should invoke the 25th Amendment, claiming President Trump is unhinged, is insane, and whatnot. Now, we've got to be careful. I've done videos discussing the 25th Amendment, so I'm not going to go into details. I'm going to be talking about defamation. What many people don't know, what many Americans don't realize, is that falsely accusing someone of having a mental illness is actually it's a crime, right? It's actually, well, in certain states it's outright it's a crime, but under the U.S. Constitution it's a civil wrong. Because the First Amendment protects you from defamation, especially with respect to making false accusations of a mental illness. It falls under the category of having a loathsome disease, or very severe mental illness. It's under that category of loathsome disease. Now, this is interesting to me. Let me just quickly give a quick disclaimer. Um, uh, I'm not your lawyer, and this doesn't constitute legal advice, but I did study First Amendment in law school. It was one of my favorite topics. I did First Amendment in law school, and in fact, my independent writing was on the First Amendment as well. So I did First Amendment as a topic in law school. So I studied it extensively. So this is somewhere that I have, some kind of um, deeper knowledge, right? Because I studied under an expert, one of the nation's notable experts on the First Amendment, very extensively. So uh, and we have to be careful with respect to making accusations that somebody has a mental illness, again, because it's something that can damage one's reputation, right? It damages one's reputation, subjects them to ridicule, public contempt, and public dishonor, and it can harm their livelihood, right? It can harm their livelihood. um, but in the case of President Trump, right, President Trump is a public official, right? So there's a different standard for them as a public official and as a public figure, right? There's a different standard for them. And so because it's a matter of public policy, right? So again, it is a crime to falsely say someone has a mental illness, right? It is a crime. It's typically a civil wrong, meaning, and in a state like Maryland, it's defamation per se, right? But it can enter a crime if you file a police report or a government uh, report it to the authorities, right? Or you commit perjury, then it becomes a crime, right? It becomes a crime. But let me quickly clarify with respect to someone like President Trump, because he is a public official, right? He's a public figure. They have different standards. Defamation hardly applies to them. By the way, something is defamatory when it is false. It has to be false. There are other standards, rare standards. I'll get into that later. But for something to be defamation, it's something that is false, right? That statement is false. It's if it's written down, then it's libel, right? If it's just spoken, then it's slander. Um, and uh, and with respect to someone like the president, right? Um, there are protections. Yeah, there are protections from lawsuits. So somebody who's been defamed can file a lawsuit in court, and then they get damages, they get paid, and things like that. And then the culprit, the perpetrator, the person who defamed them, the speaker, is warned not to do it again, and they have to pay damages, right? They pay the victim. But someone like President Trump, like I said, he's a public official, and so because it's in the interest of public policy, and there's certain areas, right, that have privileges, right, and there's absolute privilege. For instance, when we're talking about the 25th Amendment, it's the vice president and the cabinet that votes, right? And then they agree that President Trump is mentally unstable. I did a video explaining the 25th Amendment. They'll be trying to invoke the fourth section of the 25th Amendment, basically saying that, well, if they're going to be saying President Trump is unable, right, due to incapacity, right, and incapacity in this case would not be referring to him having a stroke or physical incapacity that renders him, unable to fulfill the powers and duties of his office, like in the case of Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, who was incapacitated due to a severe stroke between 1919 and 1921. That would not be the case with President Trump, right? He's active, and people will be saying that his erratic statements and he's unhinged. Some people have been saying he's insane, right? So that's what they would be trying to say, and then they would have to. That's Vice President Vance and the cabinet would have to write a letter to the president pro tempore of the Senate, right, and the Speaker of the House, right, saying, well, President Trump is insane or whatever, and so he lacks capacity to fulfill the powers and duties of his office, right? Now that would be protected. Can President Trump, even if they're lying, if he comes back, because he's allowed to counter, right? President Trump is able to counter with a letter of his own saying, well, no, he does have capacity. He's allowed to counter, right? But can he sue them? He can't sue J.D. Vance, the vice president and the cabinet, because they will be protected by absolute privilege. They have absolute privilege, right? It's protects them in official government proceedings, right? So absolute privilege protects government officials or speakers, protects the speakers. For instance, in a government proceeding, like I said, in this case, J.D. Vance writing a letter to Congress saying President Trump is insane or whatever, he's protected, right? Even if it's a lie, right? Remember, for defamation, it has to be a lie. Even if it's a lie, even if it's malicious, right? He's protected. And then Congress are protected also. Members of Congress are protected in debates on the floor from through absolute privilege, right? Even if they lie in Congress, if they make malicious statements, if they make intentionally false statements, President Trump cannot sue them, right? President Trump cannot sue them because the idea is, we're protecting free communications, open communications, and it's in the interest of public policy. It's advancing public policy, so they can't be sued there. Also, there's absolute privilege in legal proceedings as well. So judges have absolute privilege, even if the statements are false. Attorneys in court during the court proceedings, they have they're protected as well, even if their statements are false or malicious. At the same time, so judges have immunity in court during court proceedings. And there's another category of immunity. It's called qualified privilege, right? Um, uh, Qualified privilege. Qualified privilege deals with um, certain settings, right? Where high stakes. So absolute privilege, that's um, uh, high stakes. High stakes context, right? In the government, right? Top government officials, the president, right? You're trying to determine his sanity, things like that. High stake government context, right? High stakes context. Um, Qualified privilege would be certain situations as well, certain context. Um, for instance, employment situation, right? In a review between a manager and his subordinate, right? they're saying, well, that maybe their mental illness, is making them unstable. It's what you observe. Or if someone is making a good faith report to the authorities of misconduct, right? Misconduct which they have observed, they're making a good faith misconduct. Again, so the key term is that it has to be in good faith, right? It can't be done in malice. It can't be done out of spite. It can't be a malicious statement. Malicious means intentional falsity in this case, right? It can't make an intentional false statement. So with this sort of privilege, it still has to be a true statement. It can't be false. But the burden of proving that it is for false statement is on the victim, right? The plaintiff who goes to court to sue, right, for damages. So the burden is on the victim, right? So, but other than that, it is a civil wrong, at least, to make a false accusation that somebody has a mental illness. Again, but it's the victim who becomes a plaintiff in court who has to prove that it is a false statement, right? That's all they have to prove, that it's a false statement. Typically, the person who also makes that false statement, they're saying it like it's a fact, not as a matter of opinion. They're saying it like it's a fact, not as a matter of opinion, right? Um, Again, it's a civil wrong, right? But it becomes a crime if they made it to, if they filed a false police report. If they go and file a false police report, it's a crime. If they report it to the authorities, it's a crime. If they commit perjury, if they do it under oath to authorities, it's a crime. Done videos talking about Jide Iwarire, a Howard University professor who filed a perjured emergency evaluation petition, saying, making false accusations against me with respect to my mental health, right? So that is a crime, right? He was actually charged by the state of Maryland. Was charged by the state of Maryland. So that is a crime. He committed perjury. It's a crime. And at the federal level as well. I've done videos talking about swatting, right? So even at the federal level, it's a crime. It's a swatting because when he filed an emergency evaluation petition, it wasn't just an emergency evaluation petition is saying, well, there's an imminent threat, there's a public safety threat right now, right? There's a danger, and that this person has a mental illness, so it generates police, right? The SWAT team came, and they injured me, right? So it's a federal crime, right? With respect to, I think, false statements, 18 USC section 1001, and also 18 USC section 241 and section 242, 18 USC section 1038. Now, also, when the when the false accusation of somebody having a mental illness, if it becomes constitutes harassment or stalking, right? If they start stalking the person because the policeman start, monitoring the person because they assume the person is dangerous, they have a mental illness, they're dangerous, then that's a crime. It constitutes a crime. It becomes, if there's stalking involved, right, then that constitutes a crime. Harassment, that constitutes a crime. Like in my case, right, I was injured, I was tasered by the police, I was stalked. I was stalked on the internet, right? So that constitutes a crime. So making false accusations of a mental illness is very severe. It damages one's reputation, and it subjects them to public contempt. They can public dishonor within their community, and it can harm their livelihood. I haven't worked since then, since May 16, 2023, and I had a very important, significant government job, federal government job, right? Um, so uh, these are the hazards. Many people don't realize this, that making a false accusation of somebody having a mental illness is actually a crime in America, right? It's a civil wrong, and it easily becomes a crime if you go and report it to law enforcement. It's a crime. Um, because when it's done under oath, like I said, perjury, that's one, and also making a false police report, right? Because police just don't sit down there and say, oh, well, he has mental illness, so what, right? Making false statements to the police is a crime. Um, so now, so the underlying feature about defamation is it has to be a lie, right? It has to be a false statement. The burden of proof is on the victim, the plaintiff, right? That to show that, well, it is a lie, it's a false statement, right? It was done with malice or reckless disregard to the truth, or it was done out of spite or improper motive. So it's the bad burden is on the victim, the plaintiff, right, to demonstrate that. Now, but there's certain instances where it's defamation, right? Even though even though it's a true statement, right? It's a rare case where it's even though it's a true statement, but it's still actionable. It's actionable defamation, per se. Per se just means the damages are assumed, so the victim doesn't have to prove damages. They don't have to prove special or specific financial damages. The damages are just assumed, right? Because it's a damage to someone's reputation, or they lose, their job and things like that is subjected to ridicule. Now, an instance, right, special situation, which I learned in law school was, and I think it was my professor who was a woman. I think she harped on this because she was a woman. I remember she really harped on it about defamation with respect to a woman. It doesn't have to be a false statement, right? Now, you cannot say a woman has uh, an STD or VD, an STI, sexually transmitted disease, right? You cannot accuse a woman of having an STD, even if it's a true statement that she gave you an STD. It is still defamation, right? Because it's still defamation, right? And I think and the reason why this is probably the case is because women are still a vulnerable group, right? The law views women as a vulnerable class that should be protected. And I guess this goes back to, one, it's a patriarchal society still. So America still, defamation laws are still paternalistic with respect to women. But also in history, right? Historically, women's reputation mattered. That was the source of their livelihood. When women didn't have jobs, right? Women, their future was the ability to get married, right? Have the ability to get married and build a home with a man who had an income, right? So I think that those ideas, those attitudes still go down with us. They still pass down. Women have only been recently integrated into the workforce. Not been too long, maybe over 60 years, 70 years, right? 80 years with the world wars, right? They were now, um, they were acculturated into certain jobs, right? When the world was created a vacuum. But there was a time that, a woman's livelihood depended on her ability to marry, right? Her ability to marry and raise a family with a man. And if she has a damaged reputation, right, if then she wouldn't be able to do that. So claiming a woman is sexually promiscuous, right? Even if she is, right? For instance, you can't go and say, well, a woman slept with the whole football team. Even if she slept with the whole football team, it serves no purpose, right? So long as it was a consensual affair, right? It serves no purpose but to damage her reputation. And if it damages her reputation, it destroys her. That's how the law sees it. So it's not useful information, right? It's not useful information. So that will be defamation. Even if it's true, it's nobody's business. The law wants to protect women. Even if she gave you gonorrhea, you can't go and say it that she gave you gonorrhea or chlamydia. Those are treatable diseases. They're not life threatening, right? They're not life threatening. It's treatable. But so basically, the law weighs the information. Is it useful? What's the benefit of saying a woman gave you gonorrhea? And then the implications. The implications can be far-reaching. It could destroy her reputation, right? It could destroy her reputation, saying, "Well, a woman gave you making it a public affair that a woman gave you, transmitted STI around, even if it's true, right? So there's no benefit. But an STI can be easily treated. You're just one trip to the doctor, use of antibiotics, and that's it. It's easily treatable. Chlamydia, no big deal. Now, there's an exception though. If it's a life-threatening disease like HIV, right? So that's a matter of public concern. That's different. It wouldn't be defamation. She could even be liable to criminal conduct, right? If she had HIV and she knew she had HIV and she didn't inform her partner. So things like HIV, life-threatening diseases or STI, that's different. Or something, that the healthcare medical practice sort of views as, it's treatable, it's trivial in terms of treatment, like chlamydia, that's no big deal, right? So you can't say it, that you can't spread that information, you can't publicize it that, well, your girlfriend gave you an STI, because it's treatable, it would, but the impact, the implication, right, the blowback can destroy her. So that would be defamation. She has an actionable case against you. So, so basically, society protects women, right? Protects women. However, there is a there's an exception to that again, right? If it's in terms of employment, if she's your boss, right? If she's your boss and she's hitting on you, if it's your boss, that's different. She's not protected, right? It's not defamation if it's your boss. A certain context, right? And that's where qualified privilege, applies as well, right? So it's because she has a power, she has an influence over you, right? She determines your paycheck, right? So if it's your boss, and she's sexually harassing you, or she's having sex with you, or whatever, she's extorting sex from you and things like that, she's not protected because she's not, that's an employment situation, and she has power over you. She's not supposed to be exploiting you for sex. So that's a different situation. She doesn't have she can't have an actionable defamation suit. Um, so, uh, importantly, as I said, for defamation to be actionable, per se defamation, that is, it has to be a false statement, right? It has to be a false statement. The burden of proving that it's false is 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 on the victim, the plaintiff. Now, these various states have their modalities, right, regarding defamation, because again, you know, mental health, right? Mental health is has to do with state, right? It's under state purview with respect because of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment delineates jurisdiction, right? Again, remember what the 10th Amendment says: powers not specifically not delegated to the federal government, that's to the United States, that's the federal government, um, or or prohibited to the states, right? Are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. And of course, the Constitution uh, does not explicitly state mental health, right? It doesn't explicitly um, give, uh, place mental health under the federal government. So um, that's 10th Amendment it indicates that it is a state right, state under state jurisdiction. So it falls under what are called states police powers, and that's health, which includes mental health, welfare, welfare and public safety, right? Public safety. And it's because of public safety that, the state normally has an interest in knowing, you know, the mental health of its citizens, in terms of those who might be dangerous to public safety, right? That's why you have emergency evaluation petitions. But where somebody makes a false statement, right, a false accusation of someone having a mental illness, then it's a crime, right? It's a crime in the state. Different states have different rules, right? Different guidance on how it's treated. But generally, it's the federal government that says it's a civil wrong under the First Amendment, because the First Amendment protects speech, right? It protects speech, but there's certain speech that's protected, right? Insults are protected, right? You can insult somebody, it's not a crime, it's not a civil wrong either. You can insults are protected under the First Amendment. But with respect to mental illness, right, it's not protected. Mental illness, saying some falsely accusing somebody of having a mental illness, right, is not protected under the First Amendment. It's not protected because it can destroy them. It can damage their livelihood, right? It can harm their livelihood. It can destroy their reputation, hold them to public contempt and ridicule. Make them unwelcome in their community, right? So that's the reason why that's not protected. Making false accusations that somebody has a mental illness is not protected on the First Amendment, right? It's actionable, and again, it's called defamation per se when the victim doesn't have to prove damages, right? The damages are presumed, they're assumed. Um, so I'm going to do other videos and discuss more on defamation, right? And defamation and making false accusations that someone has a mental illness, and the implications. My name is Uluru Timosha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.